They told her she'd lose the farm before the leaves turned red twice. They told her a woman alone couldn't run 40 acres of horse country. And when the delivery truck backed up to her gate with an animal so big the trailer groaned under his weight, they told her that horse would be the thing that finally broke her. They were wrong about all of it, but it would take a long, quiet, brutal year before anyone but Verity Ashworth understood how wrong. Before we go further, I want you to picture this. A horse so large that grown men stepped back when the trailer door opened. A horse nobody in 3 counties would touch because the man who trained him best was already dead. Somewhere in this story, a widow who had already buried her husband, her savings, and most of her hope, looks at that animal and does not step back. If you've ever been counted out by people who never once had to survive what you survived, stay with me. Type your city in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe, because what this woman does with that giant horse in front of the very people who mocked her is not something you'll forget by tomorrow. The first frost of October came early that year, settling over Windmere Hollow like something the land had been dreading. Verity Ashworth stood at her kitchen window at 5 in the morning, coffee going cold in her hands, watching her breath fog the glass. Beyond the yard, the barn her husband built with his own hands sat half empty. Its good half rented out to boarders who paid just enough to keep the lights on and not a dollar more. 2 years. That's how long it had been since Josiah Ashworth's truck skidded off Route 9 in an ice storm nobody saw coming. Since the funeral where half the county showed up and the other half sent flowers because they were too busy circling the farm like it was already carrion. 2 years of Verity learning, alone, how to fix a fence line, how to read a feed invoice, how to say we're fine to her son's face when she wasn't sure it was true. She had learned. She was not, whatever anyone in town believed, a woman who folded easily. But learning to survive and learning to thrive were different animals entirely, and lately the gap between the two had started to feel like a canyon. The trouble had a name, and the name was Halston Merrick. He owned the sprawling cattle operation that bordered her land to the east. 3,000 acres his grandfather had carved out of the hollow before anyone else thought to try. Expanded steadily by a father who never met a neighbor's misfortune he didn't try to purchase, and now run by a son who had inherited the appetite without ever once having to earn it. Halston was 51, silver-templed, always dressed like he'd stepped out of a catalog for men who wanted you to know they didn't need the money they clearly had. He had wanted the Ashworth land for longer than Verity liked to think about, not because he needed the acreage, but because the parcel sat between 2 of his properties like a stubborn gap in a smile, and Halston Merrick did not like gaps. She'd seen him 3 days earlier at the county feed store, standing near the register with 2 of his ranch hands, loud enough that he clearly meant to be heard. Ashworth's place will be back on the market by spring, he'd said, like he was reading a weather forecast. Widow can't run 40 acres alone. Never could, if we're honest. Josiah did all the real work over there, and everybody in this county knows it. She had stood in the next aisle with a 50-pound bag of grain in her arms, and she had not said a word, because there had been nothing to say that wouldn't have made her look exactly like the fragile, failing thing he wanted the whole store to believe she was. She'd paid for her feed, loaded her truck, and driven home with her jaw so tight it ached for an hour. That was the week the call came about the horse. It came from a hauling outfit 2 counties over, Redmont Freight and Livestock, a company that used a small string of draft horses for promotional pulls at county fairs, and, when nobody was looking, for jobs too rough for a tractor. Redmont had gone under, bad loans, worse management, and its assets were being liquidated piece by piece. Trucks, trailers, and one animal nobody wanted, a Shire gelding standing over 19 hands, with a scarred foreleg, a reputation for being unmanageable, and a slaughter date already on the calendar because the cost of feeding an animal that size, doing nothing, made no economic sense to men who thought in spreadsheets. Verity had not gone looking for a horse. She had gone, at Adair Cohen's insistence, to look at a used flatbed trailer Redmont was selling cheap. It was Adair, her late husband's old training partner, a wiry 71-year-old man who still smelled permanently of liniment and pipe tobacco, who had stood beside her in that dim auction barn and gone very still when the gelding was let out. Verity, he'd said, voice low, that's not just any Shire. She hadn't understood what he meant. Not yet. All she'd understood, standing there, was the size of the animal, the sheer, staggering scale of him, a wall of muscle and history on 4 legs, ears pinned back, eyes rolling white at every stranger who came near, and the small, sharp thought that rose up in her before she could stop it. Nobody in this county thinks I can do anything worth doing. Let's see what they say about this. She had no idea yet how much that single thought would cost her, or how much it would give back. Josiah Ashworth had been, in his time, one of the finest draft horse trainers in 3 states. Before the accident, before the farm shrank to what it was now, he had run a partnership with Adair Cohen and, briefly, with a younger and considerably less silver-templed Halston Merrick, whose father had put up money for a training operation specializing in exhibition pulling teams. It had lasted for years. It had ended, as far as Verity had ever been told, in a difference of business philosophy, a phrase Josiah used exactly once and never explained further, in the particular tight-jawed way he had of closing a door on a subject and nailing it shut. Verity had married into horses, not been born to them. She'd grown up in town, the daughter of a hardware store owner, and had fallen for Josiah at a county fair when she was 22, watching him quiet a spooked pulling team with nothing but his voice and his hands while 3 other men stood back and let the animals thrash. She had spent 31 years learning his world from the outside in. Enough to keep the books, enough to muck a stall properly, never quite enough, she often thought, to have earned the right to call herself a horsewoman in her own right. Josiah had always been the one people came to see. Verity had always been the one who made sure there was coffee for them when they arrived. Then the ice storm took him, and overnight she became the only Ashworth left to answer for the whole operation. With a 17-year-old son who had inherited his father's stubbornness but none of his patience, and a debt structure she was only now, 2 years later, beginning to fully understand. The foreclosure notice arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a seed catalog and a phone bill, and Verity read it twice standing at the mailbox before she trusted herself to walk back inside. Notice of default. Windermere Agricultural Trust. 90 days to cure or vacate. She had known the mortgage was behind. 2 payments, maybe 3, after a spring where a barn roof collapse had eaten every spare dollar she had. What she had not known, what made her sit down hard at the kitchen table with the letter shaking in her hand, was that the note had been sold. Windermere Agricultural Trust was not the small regional bank Josiah had signed with 15 years earlier. It was a name she'd never heard, a name that meant nothing to her beyond the cold formality of its letterhead. Corin found her there an hour later, still at the table, the letter face down like she could unsee it by hiding the words. Mom. He was tall for 17, built like his father, with a way of standing in doorways like he wasn't sure he was allowed all the way into a room. Since Josiah died, something guarded had settled into him, a wariness Verity recognized because she wore the same expression most mornings in the bathroom mirror. It's fine, she said, the reflex answer, the one she'd used so often it barely required thought anymore. You always say that, because it's usually true. He looked at the letter she hadn't quite hidden well enough, and something in his face closed like a fist. Is it the bank again? It's being handled. That's not an answer. She wanted, badly, to tell him everything. The number at the bottom of the notice, the 90 days, the particular flavor of fear that came with realizing the ground under your children's childhood home had quietly become someone else's to take. She wanted to. She had spent 2 years deciding, meal by meal, bill by bill, that Corin had already lost a father and did not need to watch his mother crumble on top of it. So she folded the letter, tucked it into a drawer she kept for things she wasn't ready to look at twice, and said the thing she always said. Go to your chores. We'll figure it out. He left without answering, and she heard the back door slam a little harder than the wind required. That was the same week Adair drove her out to the Redmont liquidation. She told herself it was about the trailer. Cheap flatbeds didn't come along often, and with the boarding income barely covering feed, she needed every practical dollar to stretch further. What she found instead, standing in a dim barn that smelled of fear and old hay, was a horse the auctioneer described, without a trace of irony, as unsellable. 19.2 at the Withers, the young Redmont handler said, reading off a clipboard to a half-interested crowd of buyers who'd already priced him out before he was even led into the ring. Scarring on the near foreleg from a trailer accident 3 years back. Sound now. But he's got a temper on him. Pulled 2 handlers clean off their feet last spring. Companies had him on the disposal list for a month. Slaughter buyers already made an offer if nobody bids serious money today. Verity watched the animal come through the gate, and something in her chest simply stopped. He was enormous, not just tall, but built on a scale that made the men around the ring look like children by comparison. A dark bay shire with white feathering at his massive hooves and a chest like the prow of a ship. His ears were pinned flat, his eyes white-rimmed, and when the handler tugged the lead rope, he threw his head so hard the man stumbled sideways into the rail. "He's a wreck," someone behind her muttered. "Good money after bad. Whoever takes that one home." Adair, beside her, had gone very quiet, studying the horse with an intensity that seemed disproportionate to a simple auction lot. "Give him a name," he called toward the handler. Company called him King. "Doubt it matters what you call him. Nobody's bidding real money on a horse that size with a bad reputation. Feed bill alone will bankrupt you." Verity should have walked away. Every practical bone in her body, the bone that had learned, brutally, over 2 years, to count every dollar twice, told her to walk away. She had a foreclosure notice in a kitchen drawer and a boy who barely spoke to her, and a barn that was already more debt than asset. Instead, she raised her hand when the bidding opened and kept raising it twice, 3 times, until the slaughter buyer in the back row shook his head and let it go. And the auctioneer's gavel came down on a sale that made half the barn turn and stare at the widow from Ashworth Farm like she'd finally, publicly, lost her mind. She drove home that evening behind a livestock trailer that groaned with every turn, with no earthly idea how she'd pay for the diesel to get him there, let alone the hay to keep him through winter, and one thought circling in her chest that felt less like hope and more like defiance. "They already think I'm going to fail. At least let me fail doing something." She did not yet know that the horse she'd just bought had once belonged, in every way that mattered, to her husband. Word travels fast in a county where everyone's mailbox sits within sight of a neighbor's porch, and by the time Verity backed the trailer up to her own barn 2 hours later, half of Windmere Hollow already knew the widow Ashworth had bought a slaughter-bound giant nobody else would touch. Bryony Hale showed up before the trailer ramp was even down, driving over from the next farm in her ancient pickup with a look on her face that mixed genuine worry with the specific exasperation of a lifelong friend. She was 60, weathered, blunt in the way only people who'd known you since childhood were allowed to be. "Verity Jean Ashworth," she said, arms crossed, watching the trailer rock as something enormous shifted its weight inside. "Tell me you did not." "I did not what?" "Buy the horse everybody in 3 counties calls a killer. He's not a killer. He's scared. Scared animals that size still kill people. Honey, whether they mean to or not." Bryony's eyes were on the trailer door, where a single dark eye had appeared at the gap, rolling white. "You've got a boy in that house. You've got a boarding operation that can't afford one more liability. I've got a barn that's half empty and a bank note I can't make disappear by wishing," Verity said, quieter than she meant to. "I've got exactly one thing left that people in this county haven't already written off, and it's currently standing in that trailer deciding whether to kick a hole in it." That silenced Bryony, briefly. Then she softened, the way old friends did, and reached out to squeeze Verity's arm. "You know I love you. I just don't want to bury 2 Ashworths in 3 years. You won't have to." Verity said it with more certainty than she felt. Getting him off the trailer took a dare, 40 minutes, and every ounce of quiet patience the old man had left in him. The gelding backed and reared in the narrow space, ears flat, hooves striking the trailer walls hard enough to send a shudder through the whole frame, until Adair simply stopped pulling on the lead rope entirely, stood at a distance with his hands loose at his sides, and waited. "Fighting him just teaches him fighting works," Adair said, low, mostly to himself. "Man who trained horses this size knew that better than anyone I ever met." It took another 20 minutes, but eventually the animal came down the ramp on his own terms, trembling, sides heaving, and stood in the yard like a monument someone had accidentally delivered to the wrong address. Up close, in the fading light, Verity could see the old scar tissue banding his near foreleg, could see how carefully, almost protectively, he favored it even though the vet's paperwork insisted he was sound. "What are you going to call him?" Corn asked. He'd come out onto the porch despite himself, unable to resist the spectacle of an animal that size standing in their yard. Verity looked at the gelding, the sheer improbable scale of him, the way he seemed to carry some enormous invisible weight even standing still, and the name arrived without her quite deciding on it. "Atlas," she said. Corin almost smiled. Almost. The first month was, by any honest measure, a disaster. Atlas would not be caught in the field without a fight that left Verity with rope burns across both palms. He would not stand for the farrier, who took one look at the horse's temperament and quoted a price nearly double what she'd budgeted, then still refused to come back a second time after Atlas nearly put a hoof through the trailer wall he was tied to. He ate like the freight train he resembled, which meant Hey Bill's Verity genuinely did not know how she'd cover past November. Bryony's warnings started to feel less like an old friend's worry and more like a prophecy quietly fulfilling itself. And yet, there were moments, small, strange, easy to dismiss, that didn't fit the picture of a simply broken, dangerous animal. Twice, when Verity worked alone in the barn late in the evening, humming without thinking about it the same tuneless string of notes Josiah used to hum while he worked, she turned to find Atlas standing dead still at the stall door, ears forward, watching her with an attention that felt less like wariness and more like recognition. Once, when she fumbled a bucket and swore under her breath the exact old-fashioned way Josiah used to when a task went sideways. Well, hell, and half of Georgia, Atlas let out a low, huffing breath that sounded, absurdly, almost like agreement. And once, exhausted and out of patience after another failed attempt to lead him from the field, she'd simply sat down in the grass 10 feet away, put her head in her hands, and said out loud, to no one, "I don't know what I'm doing." She hadn't meant it for the horse. But when she finally looked up, Atlas had crossed the distance between them entirely on his own and was standing over her, close enough that his breath stirred her hair, close enough that she could have reached up and touched the scarred foreleg he never let anyone near. She sat very still. He didn't move away. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'm listening if you are." It was Adair, watching from the fence line one gray November afternoon, who finally said the thing that had clearly been sitting behind his eyes since the auction barn. "Verity," he said slowly, "I need you to hear me say something, and I need you to actually hear it. That horse isn't just any shire that fell on hard luck. I've been around draft animals my whole life, and the way he moves, the commands he half remembers even when he's fighting you, that's not generic training. That's a specific method, a specific hand. Whose?" Adair looked at her for a long moment. The way a man looks at someone he's about to hand a weight he isn't sure they can carry. "Yours," he said, "or near enough. That's Josiah's training in that animal's bones, Verity. I'd bet my truck on it." It took 2 weeks of digging through paperwork, old Redmont bills of sale, a scribbled purchase history buried in a folder the liquidation company had barely bothered to organize, before Verity found the thread that turned Adair's hunch into something closer to certainty. Atlas had come to Redmont Freight 7 years earlier, purchased at another liquidation auction from a training operation that had dissolved under murky circumstances. The name on that earlier bill of sale stopped her cold at the kitchen table. Merrick Ashworth Draft Training, LLC. She sat with it a long time before she trusted her own hands enough to keep reading. She knew, in outline, that Josiah's partnership with Halston's father had ended badly, years before she'd fully understood how badly. What she had never known, what Josiah, in whatever quiet grief or pride kept him silent, had never told her, was that the partnership's most promising young shire, a colt Josiah himself had started and named simply King in the company's own records, had been part of the assets divided when the operation collapsed, and according to a faded, water-stained ledger page Adair eventually dug out of his own barn, records he'd kept, he admitted with some shame, because he'd never quite trusted the elder Merrick even back then. The split had not been fair. Not close. "Your husband trained that horse from a yearling," Adair told her, spreading the old ledger pages across her kitchen table like evidence in a trial nobody had ever brought. "Best colt to come through that operation in a decade. Everybody said so at the time. When the partnership went sideways, and it went sideways because Merrick's father was cooking the books, skimming client fees, something Josiah found out about and wouldn't stay quiet on. The elder Merrick used his lawyers and his money to make sure the split favored him on paper. Josiah walked away with debt and a bruised name. Merrick walked away with the training contracts, most of the equipment, and King. And Josiah never told me. Your husband," Adair said gently, "was the proudest man I ever worked beside, and the kind of proud that doesn't complain, it just goes quiet and starts over somewhere smaller. He built this farm from nothing after that, Verity told himself and everybody else it was the life he wanted all along. Maybe some of that was even true, but I don't think he ever stopped wondering what happened to that colt. Verity sat with her coffee going cold, looking at a photograph Adair had also produced. Grainy, decades old. Josiah, at maybe 30, one hand resting on the neck of a leggy young shire with a white blaze that, even faded and small in the photo, was unmistakably the same animal now standing in her own barn. The realization landed with a strange, layered weight. Grief, first, a fresh cut across an old wound. Learning something new and painful about a man she'd thought she knew completely. Then something else, something that took longer to name because it felt almost too large to hold. The sense that some enormous, improbable circle had closed itself without her permission, that the horse standing in her barn wasn't simply a wounded animal she'd rescued on impulse, but the last living piece of an injustice her husband had carried silently for 30 years, and that it had found its way back to Ashworth land. To Ashworth hands, entirely by accident, or not entirely by accident. She thought of Atlas's ears turning toward her humming, the way he'd crossed the field on his own to stand over her when she broke down in the grass. Whatever memory lived in that enormous body, it had not forgotten who Josiah Ashworth was, or the training method he'd spent a yearling's worth of patience building into him. She might have let the discovery sit quietly, grief being complicated enough without adding a fresh confrontation to it. If the second piece of paperwork buried in the same liquidation folder hadn't changed the stakes entirely. It was a lease document, 3 years old, transferring certain hauling contracts from Redmont Freight to a subsidiary called Winmere Agricultural Trust, the very name printed at the top of Verity's foreclosure notice. She hadn't recognized it before because it meant nothing to her. Now, cross-referenced against the ledger pages Adair had kept, against a state business registry, Merle Talone at the bank quietly, nervously agreed to pull up for her one afternoon when Verity finally worked up the courage to ask a direct question instead of accepting another polite non-answer. The name behind Winmere Agricultural Trust resolved into something Verity had half suspected and desperately hoped wasn't true. "I shouldn't be showing you this," Merle said, voice low, glancing toward the manager's office like she expected to be overheard. She was younger than Verity, sharp-eyed, and had always treated Verity with a kindness that felt, in hindsight, like quiet guilt. "But you deserve to know whose name is actually on your note, Mrs. Ashworth. Winmere Agricultural Trust isn't some outside investment fund. It's a shell entity, registered 2 years ago. The controlling member is Merrick Land and Cattle Holdings." Verity stared at the printout until the letters blurred. "He bought my mortgage. He bought it from the original lender, quietly, about 18 months back, right around when the bank was looking to clear some smaller notes off its books at a discount. Perfectly legal. But I don't think it's a coincidence, and I don't think you should think it's one either." 90 days on a foreclosure notice from an anonymous trust was frightening. 90 days on a foreclosure notice from the very man who'd stood in a feed store predicting her failure out loud, who'd wanted her land for years, who, she now understood, had a father who'd already stolen once from an Ashworth and gotten away clean, was something else entirely. It wasn't dead anymore. It was a second attempt at the same theft, playing out 1 generation later, with Verity standing exactly where Josiah once stood, outmatched on paper, and expected to simply fold. She thought about folding. God help her, there was an hour that night, alone in the kitchen with both pieces of paper spread in front of her, where folding felt like the only sane option left. Corin was asleep. The house was quiet except for the wind working at the old windows. She thought about how much simpler it would be to sell now, on her own terms, take whatever Merrick's trust offered, move Corin somewhere smaller, somewhere the Ashworth name didn't come with 30 years of complicated history attached. Then she thought about Atlas, standing in the field in the dark, carrying inside him the last living proof that Josiah Ashworth had once built something extraordinary, and that it had been taken from him quietly, legally, and completely, by a family that clearly believed it could do the exact same thing twice. She did not sleep that night, but by the time the sun came up gray over the frost-heavy fields, she had stopped thinking about folding and started thinking, for the first time in 2 years, about what it would actually take to win. The Winmere Harvest Poll had run every October for 61 years, a county tradition older than most of the families who attended it, where draft teams competed to haul progressively heavier sledges across a measured stretch of the fairground, the winning team's owner taking home not just a trophy, but a purse that had, over decades of local sponsorship and betting pool tradition, grown to a figure that made Verity's breath catch the first time she actually looked it up. $11,000. It was, give or take a few hundred, almost exactly the amount standing between her and the number printed on the foreclosure notice in her kitchen drawer. She told no one her plan for 3 full days after she decided it, turning it over alone, testing it for holes, before she finally said it out loud to Adair on a cold morning in the barn, half expecting him to talk her out of it. He didn't. "It's a hard road," he said instead, running a hand slowly down Atlas's enormous shoulder while the horse stood, unusually calm, letting him. Pulling's not just size, Verity. It's trust. An animal has to believe, all the way down, that the person asking him to lean into that harness knows what she's doing and isn't going to let anything bad happen to him while he does it. "You've had this horse 11 weeks. Most teams train together for years. I don't have years." "I know it." He was quiet a moment. "I also know your husband built a training program specifically designed to get a big, distrustful animal to that kind of trust faster than anybody thought possible. I watched him do it twice. If it's in that horse's memory at all, and I think it might be, we might have a chance nobody else in this county would give us." They started that same week, before dawn most mornings, so Verity could still cover barn chores and border feedings by the time the sun was fully up. Adair brought out an old training harness he'd kept, half out of sentiment, half out of habit, in his own barn for 15 years. A harness, Verity realized with a tightening in her chest when she saw the faded initials burned into the leather that had belonged to Josiah. The early sessions were nothing like triumph. Atlas fought the harness the first 4 mornings, through his head, backed hard enough into the traces that Verity's hands blistered raw holding the line steady. Adair stood beside her through every failure, voice low and even, correcting her grip, her stance, the pace of her breathing, because, he told her plainly, animals that size read a handler's fear before they read anything else, and fear was the one thing she absolutely could not afford to carry into that harness. "You're not fighting him," Adair said, again and again, echoing what he'd told her the day they unloaded the trailer. "You're asking him to trust that leaning into that weight with you means something better waits on the other side of it. That's the whole method. That's all training ever was, with your husband." Corin started coming out to watch on the 5th morning, standing at the fence with his hands jammed in his jacket pockets, saying nothing, though Verity noticed he stayed longer each day. By the 2nd week, he was holding the second lead line during groundwork without being asked. By the 3rd, he was the one who figured out, through nothing but patient repetition, that Atlas responded better to a low 2-note whistle than to any verbal command. A discovery that came, Adair pointed out quietly, from the exact kind of intuitive, patient observation his father had been famous for. "You've got his eye for this," Adair told the boy, and Verity watched something shift in her son's shoulders, some old tension easing for the first time in 2 years. The weight sledges started light, 400 pounds, then 6, building slowly enough that Atlas's confidence grew alongside his strength instead of being overwhelmed by it. There were setbacks. A morning in late October when a sudden gust sent a tarp snapping loose near the practice field, and Atlas bolted so hard, he dragged Verity 10 feet through the mud before Adair got a hand on the bridle. Leaving her with a wrenched shoulder, she hid from Corin for 3 days rather than worry him. A week after that, the farrier they'd finally convinced to come back found early signs of strain in the old scarred foreleg. And for 2 agonizing days Verity thought the whole plan might end there, on a vet's cautious diagnosis, before a course of rest and careful reshoeing brought the horse back sound. Word of what she was attempting spread through the county exactly as fast as word of the horse's purchase had. Some of it was kind. Bryony showed up most evenings now with a thermos of coffee and, eventually, grudging admiration replacing her earlier warnings. Merle Talone, careful never to say anything that could cost her job, made a point of stopping by the fairgrounds on her lunch break, often enough that Verity understood exactly which side of the situation the young bank clerk was quietly rooting for. Some of it was not kind. Halston Merrick heard, of course, everyone assumed he would, and he did not disappoint. He arrived at the feed store the same week entry forms opened for the harvest pull, loud again, deliberate again, making sure the whole store heard him laugh when someone mentioned Verity Ashworth's name on the entry list. "That's almost sweet," he said, to no one and everyone. "Woman doesn't know when to stop swinging. I'll tell you what, I'll put my own money on the board right now. Merrick pulling team wins like it does every year, and the widow's big broken horse doesn't finish the course. Somebody write that down. It got back to her within the hour, the way everything did. She stood in her kitchen that night with the words sitting hot in her chest. And for the first time in 2 years, the humiliation didn't curdle into shame. It hardened into something else, something close to resolve. Let him bet, she said out loud. To the empty kitchen, to Josiah's old ledger still sitting on the table where she'd left it. Let him say it in front of everybody. I want him to. Entry day, she drove into town, walked into the fairgrounds office past a small cluster of Merrick's ranch hands loitering near the door, and signed Ashworth Farm and Atlas onto the roster for the 62nd annual Windmere Harvest Pull, in the heaviest weight class the competition allowed. Behind her, she heard one of the hands mutter something to another, low enough that he probably thought she wouldn't hear it. Boss is gonna love this. She didn't turn around. She just walked back to her truck, climbed in, and, for the first time in longer than she could remember, let herself smile the whole drive home. The morning of the harvest pull broke clear and cold, the fairgrounds already thick with trucks and trailers by 7, the smell of frying dough and diesel exhaust hanging over the whole valley. By the time Verity backed Atlas's trailer into the competitor's lot, half the county seemed to already be watching, drawn as much by the spectacle of the size of him as by the story that had spread, in the particular way small-town stories spread, faster and further than the truth ever traveled on its own. The pulling course ran the length of the main arena, a measured track where teams hauled a weighted stoneboat sledge as far as they could before their line of forward motion stopped, each round adding weight, until only one team remained capable of moving the load. Merrick's team, a matched pair of enormous Belgians, glossy and expertly conditioned, driven by a hired professional handler Halston had brought in from 2 states over, pulled first and pulled well, drawing a wave of appreciative applause that Halston, standing at the rail in a crisp new jacket, accepted like it belonged to him personally. Atlas pulled alone. In a single-horse class Adair had entered him into once it became clear no other draft animal in the county could be safely paired beside him, a decision that drew open mockery from the crowd near the rail, a horse competing against teams of 2, until his first pull, at 1,800 pounds, moved the sledge 4 feet further than anything that had come before it, and the mockery went suddenly, sharply quiet. By the 4th round, at 3,200 pounds, it was Atlas and Merrick's Belgian team, and only them, still on the course. Halston's easy confidence had thinned into something tighter around his eyes. Verity stood at Atlas's head between rounds, one hand flat against his enormous neck, feeling the tremor of effort running through him, and found herself murmuring the same tuneless string of notes she used to hum without thinking in the barn, Josiah's notes, whether she'd ever fully realized that was where they came from or not. Atlas's ear turned toward her voice. His breathing steadied. "One more," she whispered. "That's all I'm asking." She never got to ask for it. The sound came from the covered bridge at the northern edge of the fairgrounds, a groan of old timber, followed by a metallic shriek and a chorus of shouting that cut through the arena's noise like a blade. Every head turned. A cattle transport, one of Merrick's own trucks, loaded and running behind schedule for a sale 2 towns over, had misjudged the load limit sign on the old wooden bridge, a sign half the county privately joked was more suggestion than rule, and the rear axle had punched clean through a rotted support beam. The trailer hung at a sickening angle over the ravine below, front wheels still on solid decking, rear end sagging into empty space, timbers cracking audibly under a weight. The old bridge was never built to hold a second longer than it already had. 2 men were in the cab. Verity could see them, even from the arena. The driver frozen with one hand on the door, a younger hand pale-faced in the passenger seat, both of them understanding, with the particular stillness of people who know movement itself might be the thing that finishes the collapse, that jumping might send the whole structure down with them still close enough to be caught in it. The volunteer fire truck was 11 miles out at a brush fire call. Somebody screamed it across the arena before Verity's mind had even finished processing what she was looking at. 11 miles, 20 minutes at best, and the bridge groaning louder with every passing second, and no crane, no tow truck, nothing in Windmere Hollow with the pulling power to drag 3 tons of stuck cattle trailer backward off a failing structure before it gave way entirely. Nothing except what stood beside her, still in harness, chest heaving from 3,200 pounds, Exactly the animal every person at that fairground had spent 11 weeks calling too big, too broken, too dangerous to be worth the trouble. Verity did not remember deciding. She remembered Adair's hand briefly on her arm, not pulling her back, but steadying her, and his voice, rough and certain, "Go. I'll clear you a path." She remembered running Atlas at a pace she'd never dared push him to, harness chains ringing, the crowd scattering ahead of them toward the bridge, Corin's voice somewhere behind her shouting her name in a register she'd never heard from him before. Not a boy anymore in that moment, just terror for his mother, raw and total. The bridge access was too narrow for a truck, too unstable for anything with an engine's dead weight to risk crossing. But a single enormous horse, careful-footed despite his size, could be led onto the solid front third of the decking, close enough to set a tow chain, grabbed from the nearest stock trailer by hands Verity didn't have time to think, around the trailer's front hitch. "Easy," she said, voice shaking despite every effort to steady it, standing at Atlas's head with the chain drawn taut behind them, the failing bridge groaning under the strain of a truck it should never have carried in the first place. "Easy. I know you're tired. I know. I need one more. Just one more. And then we're done. I promise you, we're done." She felt, more than saw, the moment he understood. His ears came forward, fixed on her voice the exact way they had the day she'd broken down alone in the field and he'd crossed the distance to stand over her. His enormous chest dropped low, weight sinking back into the harness, hooves finding purchase in the packed dirt of the bridge approach, and he leaned. The chain snapped taut with a crack like a rifle shot. For one terrible half-second nothing moved at all, the whole scene frozen. Horse, chain, groaning timber, two men gripping their door handles in a cab that hung over open air, and then, with a shudder that Verity felt travel up through her own boots, the trailer's rear wheels began, impossibly, to slide backward across broken decking, inch by inch. Atlas's hooves digging deep furrows into the dirt as he threw every last reserve of strength he had left into the harness. The bridge gave way a full 3 seconds after the trailer's rear axle finally cleared the collapsing section, timbers folding downward into the ravine in a cloud of splinters and dust, the sound of it swallowed almost entirely by the roar of the crowd that had gone, in the space of a breath, from stunned silence to something closer to disbelief made audible. The two men climbed out of the cab on legs that barely held them, and the younger one, the pale-faced passenger, made it exactly 4 steps towards solid ground before he sat straight down in the dirt and put his face in his hands. Verity stood at Atlas's head, both of them trembling, her hand pressed flat against his sweat-soaked neck, and for one long, suspended moment the entire fairground was simply silent. A whole county standing shoulder to shoulder, staring at a widow and a horse everyone had spent a year calling too broken to matter. Then someone started clapping, and then everyone was. Halston Merrick did not clap. He stood near the wreckage of the bridge access, staring at the trailer his own driver had nearly died in, at the horse that had just saved 2 of his employees' lives, and at the widow he had spent a year publicly predicting would fail, and something in his carefully maintained composure simply came apart in front of the whole county. It was Merle Talone, of all people, standing near enough to hear it, who later told Verity what happened next, how the younger driver, still shaking, still sitting in the dirt, had looked up at his boss and said, loud enough for a dozen people to hear, "You had that load sign moved back on that bridge 2 years ago, didn't you?" Said the old limit was overcautious. How Halston's silence in response had told the assembled crowd everything his mouth refused to. The story unraveled fast after that, the way stories do once the first thread gets pulled in front of enough witnesses. A county inspector, called out that same afternoon to assess the bridge collapse, found paperwork, buried, but not buried well enough, showing the load limit signage had indeed been altered following a request from Merrick Land and Cattle, filed under the argument that heavier equipment needed regular access. It wasn't criminal, not quite, not in the way that would put anyone behind bars. But it was reckless and public, and it painted a picture the whole county could suddenly see clearly. A man who cut corners when they benefited him and let other people absorb the risk. That same week, with the story still fresh enough that it had made the front page of the county paper under a photograph of Verity and Atlas standing at the collapsed bridge, Merle Talone quietly walked a complete paper trail into the county prosecutor's office, the shell entity, the discounted note purchase, the timeline that lined up a little too neatly with Halston's public predictions of Verity's failure. Nothing about buying a mortgage note was illegal on its own. But paired with everything else now surfacing about Halston Merrick, it read, to a county that had just watched a widow's rescued horse save 2 lives on live public display, like exactly what it was, a rich man's quiet, ongoing effort to finish what his father had started 30 years earlier. Halston did not go to jail. He did, within a month, quietly sell the note back to a proper regional lender at Verity's original terms, through a lawyer who made a point of never using Halston's name directly in any conversation with her again. He did not show his face at the feed store for the better part of a season, and when he finally did, nobody laughed with him the way they once had. Verity, for her part, took her $11,000 harvest poll purse, awarded, in the end, not for finishing the competition, since neither team had crossed the final line, but by unanimous decision of the Fairground Committee, who declared the round's outcome self-evident to everyone who'd witnessed it, and paid down her restructured note in a single visit to the bank. Standing at Merle Talon's window while the younger woman processed the payment with unmistakable satisfaction. "Never thought I'd enjoy paperwork this much," Merle said, sliding the receipt across the counter. "Neither did I," Verity admitted, and meant it. Winter came properly a few weeks later, the way it always did in Windmere Hollow. But for the first time in 2 years, Verity watched the first real snowfall from her kitchen window, without the familiar tightness in her chest that used to accompany the season's arrival. The barn was full again, not just with boarders drawn, more than a few of them admitted, by curiosity about the horse who'd made the local news, but with the particular kind of fullness that came from a farm no longer teetering on the edge of disappearing. Corin had changed in ways that showed themselves slowly, the way real change usually did. He'd stopped standing in doorways like a guest in his own house. He took the early feeding shift most mornings now without being asked, and more than once Verity had come out to the barn to find him talking quietly to Atlas while he worked. The same low two-note whistle he'd discovered months earlier, now a fixture of the horse's daily routine. He'd started asking questions, too, about his father, about the training methods, about the partnership that had ended so badly. Questions Verity found, to her own surprise, she was finally ready to answer honestly. "He would have liked watching you figure that whistle out," she told her son one evening, both of them leaning on the paddock rail while Atlas grazed in the last gray light. "He always said the best training wasn't something you did to a horse. It was something you noticed, if you paid close enough attention." "Do you think he knew?" Corin asked, "that Atlas was out there somewhere all those years?" Verity considered the question honestly before she answered it. "I think he wondered. I think maybe that's part of why he built this place the way he did. Kept the door open, in case something he'd started somewhere else ever found its way back." Adair still came by most mornings, though the training sessions had softened now into something closer to companionship than urgent necessity. An old man and a rescued horse and a woman who'd finally stopped needing to prove anything to anyone but herself. Bryony's visits had settled into the same easy rhythm they'd always had, minus the worry that used to sharpen the edges of her voice. Halston Merrick's cattle operation, Verity heard through the particular efficiency of small-town gossip, had quietly scaled back its ambitions along the county line. He never approached her about the land again. She saw him occasionally, at a distance, at the feed store or on the road, and neither of them acknowledged it beyond the barest nod two neighbors owed each other, which was, she'd come to feel, exactly enough. On the anniversary of Josiah's death, Verity walked out to the field alone in the early morning, the way she had every year since he'd been gone, carrying with her, this time, the faded photograph Adair had given her, Josiah at 30, one hand resting on the neck of a leggy young Shire with a white blaze. She found Atlas standing near the fence line where the sun came up first, and she stood beside him a long while, saying nothing, simply resting her hand against the same white blaze, now broader and older, that had marked him as a colt 3 decades earlier. "You found your way home," she said finally, quiet enough that the words barely disturbed the frost-heavy air. "Took the long way, but you made it." Atlas huffed once, low and warm, and lowered his enormous head until it rested, briefly, against her shoulder. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles over a piece of land once it stops being fought over. Not the silence of emptiness, but the deeper quiet of something finally allowed to simply exist the way it was always meant to. That's the quiet that settled over Ashworth Farm that winter, and the one that remains there still. If you happen to drive Route 9 past Windmere Hollow on a clear morning and glance toward the fence line, where a horse too big for anyone's expectations grazes beside a woman nobody thought would make it this far. Nobody in that county talks anymore about whether Verity Ashworth would fail. They talk instead, when her name comes up, about the size of the animal standing in her field, and about the particular quiet stubbornness it takes to keep loving something everyone else has already given up on. A farm, a memory, a horse too large for easy explanation. Until, somehow, against every prediction stacked against you, it starts loving you back. Maybe you know someone like that. Maybe, some mornings, you were someone like that yourself, counted out early by people who never had to survive what you survived, standing at your own version of that gate, wondering if it's foolish to keep believing something worth saving is still worth the fight. Verity Ashworth would probably tell you it isn't foolish at all. She'd probably tell you, standing at that same fence line with her hand resting on a scarred and mended foreleg that everyone once called ruined, that some of the most important things in this life arrive looking exactly like failure, right up until the moment they don't.